It was a heavy afternoon in Jerusalem, a day that seemed never-ending. The sky darkened in the full light of midday, the ground shook, and everyone nearby felt as if the universe itself had held its breath. High on a hill, amid groans and silence, the Son of God expired. But what many didn't understand was that this wasn't the end of a story. It was merely the beginning of a transformation that would forever change the course of humanity. And it's this moment, the world after Jesus' death, that you're about to delve into. A story few have the courage to tell, but once known, can never be forgotten. If you stay until the end, you'll not only understand the weight of this day, but you'll feel how its same impact can transform your own life. By the way, before we continue, take the opportunity to like, subscribe, and comment below about what you hope to learn from this story. It may seem like a simple gesture, but by doing so, you help this message reach more people who also need to feel this same hope. Those who participate here reap a benefit that isn't immediately visible, but can be felt, their hearts open to hear truths that illuminate the soul. Immediately after the last breath, a strange silence took over the city. It was as if even the birds had stopped singing. In the temple, the veil, thick as a wall, was torn from top to bottom, exposing the Holy of Holies. The priests were terrified. Some fell to the ground, others screamed, convinced they were witnessing something divine and beyond explanation. The Roman soldiers, accustomed to death and war, looked at one another in silence. One of them, the centurion who had commanded the crucifixion, murmured with a trembling voice, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." That sentence echoed like a verdict, as if even the most powerful empire in the world had been forced to acknowledge what had just happened. The streets of Jerusalem remained deserted for hours. People who moments earlier had mocked now hid inside their homes, shutting doors and windows, as if they could protect themselves from the invisible weight hanging in the air. Each family whispered in secret, wondering what it meant to have witnessed an eclipse at midday, a devastating earthquake, and signs that no scholar could explain. In one of the houses near the temple, an elderly woman, blind since youth, lifted her face to the sky and said, "I cannot see, but I can feel the Holy One was among us." Her words spread among the neighbors and quickly became a testimony that brought both comfort and fear. Meanwhile, the most influential priests gathered in haste. The sound of the torn veil echoed in their minds, a wound cut deep into their religious pride. Some believed it was a terrible omen, proof that they had made the greatest mistake of their lives, but others, hardened by power, conspired to twist that sign into something that could be silenced through manipulation and deceit. The Roman soldiers, men trained never to show weakness, were disturbed. The centurion who had acknowledged Jesus could not sleep that night. The image of the cross burned in his memory. He remembered the eyes of Christ, not filled with hatred, but with a compassion that pierced through his armor and reached his soul. Some merchants in the city began to report strange occurrences. Animals were restless, refusing to eat. Children woke up screaming, saying they had seen luminous figures in the dark corners of their homes. Fear turned into rumor, and rumor grew until it became a wave of despair that swept over the entire region. In the nearby mountains, shepherds claimed to have seen the sky open in silent flashes of lightning, as if an invisible battle were being fought above their heads. They did not understand what they saw, but they knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Among the disciples, hidden and torn apart by grief, there was only silence. Some could not pray. Others questioned everything they had believed. Peter especially felt the unbearable weight of betrayal. Each tear he shed was like a knife in his conscience, reminding him of the look in Jesus' eyes before he was taken away. At dawn the next day, the city's marketplace looked like a ghost town. Few dared to trade, and those who walked the streets did so quickly, glancing over their shoulders as if being watched. The atmosphere was one of collective mourning, even among those who had not followed Jesus. The air carried the sense that an invisible boundary had been crossed. A young scribe secretly recorded the events of that day. His words were trembling, filled with fear, yet carried a clear insight. Never has the earth shaken like this. Never have men been so silent. Something greater than empires has passed among us. These writings, hidden in secret scrolls, would be found centuries later, preserving the memory of that moment. As the body of Jesus was laid in the tomb, armed guards received strict orders to keep watch. Yet within them, unease grew. What power could weapons have against one whom even nature seemed to obey? They did their duty, but fear gnawed at them from within. Outside the city, travelers coming from distant regions listened to the accounts in astonishment. Some turned back immediately, carrying the news that Jerusalem had witnessed apocalyptic signs. Thus, the message of what had happened at the crucifixion began to cross borders even before the resurrection. Mary Magdalene, overcome with grief, spent hours sitting near the tomb. Her eyes were red, her soul shattered. Yet even through her tears, she whispered prayers. It was as if, deep within her, something told her this was not the end. The religious leaders, on the other hand, gathered in secret. Fearing that the disciples might steal the body, they decided to reinforce the guard and spread rumors. But deep down, even they could not shake the feeling that they had unleashed something they could never control. Amid all this tension, an intriguing detail began to circulate among the temple guards. When the veil was torn, a sound like invisible trumpets echoed through the corridors. No one could explain it, but everyone who was there was marked forever. And that night, when Jerusalem finally grew silent, a strange wind swept through the city's alleys. It was not an ordinary breeze, but a heavy, almost sacred breath. Those who felt it described it as a warning. Something greater was about to happen. While the city tried to process the horror, the disciples were in hiding. In a dark room with locked doors, fear was palpable. They had not only lost the master, they had lost hope. Peter wept inconsolably, remembering his betrayal. John stared into the void, reliving every word spoken from the cross. Mary, the mother of Jesus, wrapped in mourning, felt a pain too deep for words. But in the unseen, something greater was unfolding. While men wept, eternity was moving. The oil lamps flickered in the closed room, casting shadows that seemed to deepen their anguish. At every sound from the street, the disciples trembled, fearing that Roman soldiers would burst in and drag them to the same fate as the Master. It was as if hope had been smothered by fear, and every second in that darkness felt unbearably heavy. Amid her tears, Mary Magdalene whispered softly, "He said he would return. He said he would rise again." Her words sounded like madness to some, but to others they were the only flame still burning in their hearts. Yet no one dared to believe fully. Death felt far too final, and the emptiness overwhelming. Peter, consumed by guilt, could not look anyone in the eye. His heart bled with the memory of Jesus' words, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." He knew he had failed at the most crucial moment, and that weight was eating him alive. More than he feared the Romans, Peter feared there was no redemption left for him. In the midst of the silence, a child, the daughter of one of the followers who had taken refuge there, asked innocently if he was the Son of God. Why did he let them kill him? The question echoed like an open wound. No adult answered, but everyone felt the same doubt gnawing at their hearts. Outside, the bells of the temple rang, marking the night. To the disciples, each toll sounded like a hammer striking, reminding them of the end. But in the heavens, the reality was different. While men believed everything was over, in the unseen, Jesus was already fulfilling what he had promised: to conquer death, break the chains of hell, and take for himself the keys of eternity. In some corners of the city, people dreamed strange dreams that night. They saw fields bathed in light, heard voices singing, and doors being opened. They awoke frightened, not realizing they were witnessing reflections of a spiritual battle unfolding in another realm. Back in the locked room, John began to recall in a low voice, he said he would go to prepare a place for us. He said he would not leave us as orphans. His words brought tears to Mary's eyes, but also a breath of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, the cross was not the end. Even so, the darkness seemed to have won. Every minute was torture. The disciples did not know that, beyond their fear, the silence of the tomb concealed the most powerful movement in history. The resurrection was drawing near, and the world would never be the same again. In that locked room, where hearts were shattered, a promise was about to be fulfilled. For while men surrendered to fear, eternity was preparing the greatest new beginning in human history. That night, rumors spread. Witnesses swore they had seen the dead rising from their tombs at the very moment Jesus gave up his spirit. Others claimed they felt a suffocating presence while walking through the streets. Jerusalem seemed split in two. On one side, fear; on the other, mystery. And in the darkness, every heart knew that something beyond human understanding was taking place. A merchant returning from the road to Jericho swore he had seen figures dressed in white, walking silently through the narrow streets, leaving no footprints on the stone. He tried to follow them, but as he drew near, the figures vanished before his eyes like smoke in the wind. His trembling voice, as he recounted what had happened, only deepened the terror among the townspeople. On the outskirts of the city, a family keeping vigil over a deceased relative was startled by knocks at the door. When they opened it, they saw the very man they had buried days earlier standing before them, eyes filled with tears and a look of peace on his face. The account spread quickly. Some believed it was mass hysteria, while others fell to their knees, convinced that the supernatural had broken every barrier. Priests tried to suppress the rumors, but even among them, doubt was growing. Some temple guards reported feeling a cold wind in the corridors, as if an invisible presence moved through every sacred space. The fear was so intense that many avoided entering the holy place alone at night. Children awoke in terror, claiming to have seen men in ancient clothing walking around their houses, looking through the windows and then vanishing. Parents tried to console them, but deep down, they knew something strange was happening. The air was too heavy to be mere childish imagination. In taverns and markets, men spoke in whispers, afraid of being overheard. Some said the dead had returned to warn them. Others claimed divine wrath was only beginning. Opinions were divided, but one feeling was unanimous. Jerusalem was no longer the same since the crucifixion. A young woman, returning from the well with jars of water, claimed to have seen a massive shadow cross the sky, as if an invisible army was marching upon the clouds. Her voice trembled as she described it, yet the light in her eyes showed it was no fabrication. The impression grew stronger. The heavens were at war. In Pilate's palace, the Roman governor could find no rest. He dreamed again and again of Jesus' gaze before death, and every time he closed his eyes, he heard a haunting phrase, "You would have no power over me unless it were given you from above." Pilate woke in a cold sweat, realizing he had taken part in something far greater than politics or judgment. Meanwhile, in the nearby villages, stories multiplied. Travelers swore they had encountered radiant figures proclaiming with firm voices, "He has triumphed." These reports, though dismissed by many, rekindled the flame of hope in broken hearts. And so, that night, caught between fear and expectation, Jerusalem became the stage for a mystery unlike any other. The rumors not only spread terror, but silently prepared the city for the revelation that would change everything. The victory over death was drawing near, and nothing could stop what was about to happen. While the body of Jesus lay in the tomb, guarded by armed soldiers, no one knew what was taking place in the unseen realm. Yet ancient traditions tell that he descended into the depths, proclaiming victory over death and breaking the chains that bound souls. In the silence of the cold stone, the greatest battle in history was being fought. For mankind, it was defeat. For heaven, it was triumph. In the darkest regions beyond, where hope seemed extinguished, an unexpected light appeared. It was not an ordinary light, but a brilliance no shadow could withstand. The gates of spiritual captivity, which for ages had held multitudes in bondage, began to quake before the presence of the one who bore the authority of eternity. Ancient accounts describe how the gates of Hades trembled as Jesus approached. The chains that kept souls silent broke like straw before the fire. The impossible had happened. The shackles of death no longer held power. The spirits who once wept in despair began to lift their heads. It was as if a heavenly breeze swept through the darkest place of existence. Every gaze turned toward the one who walked in majesty, carrying not the sword of war, but the victory of life. Amid the terror of darkness, the voice of Christ thundered, "It is finished." And in that echo, invisible walls crumbled. Eternity had witnessed the moment when the Son conquered the final enemy, death itself. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, no one knew what was unfolding in the unseen. The soldiers at the tomb were restless, feeling a weight they could not explain. Every moment they stared at the sealed stone, as if afraid that something within might break free. In the silence of the grave, the lifeless body of Jesus lay still, but around it, unseen forces stirred. All of creation waited for the instant when life would pulse again. It was as though the universe itself had paused to witness the most important scene in history. The prophecies, once whispered by prophets, were now being fulfilled before the spiritual eyes of all heaven. The Lamb, slain for the sins of the world, walked in triumph through the realms of death, bearing upon himself the key of eternal victory. Every step Jesus took in the unseen was accompanied by a reverent silence. Not even the angels dared to interrupt, for this was not merely a rescue, it was the beginning of a new era where death would never again have the final word. And so, while men believed that everything was over, heaven celebrated the greatest victory ever written. The tomb was still silent, but that silence was only the prelude to a roar. The resurrection that would forever change the destiny of humanity. Rome tried to maintain order. The priests conspired to suppress the facts, and the families who had witnessed the darkening of the sky still trembled in fear. Many could not sleep, convinced that God himself had visited the earth. But the dawn of the third day brought a sound no army could stop. An angel descended, the earth shook once more, and the stone of the tomb was rolled away. The soldiers, men hardened by blood and war, fainted like children. The body was no longer there. The empty tomb cried out louder than any army. The radiance that surrounded the tomb that morning was not of this world. It was a light that seemed to cut through the veil of night and illuminate even the darkest corners of the city. Some nearby residents swore they saw this brilliant streak across the heavens, as if the sky itself had opened to witness the impossible. The sound of the stone being moved echoed like thunder in the guards' ears. Those men who had never feared armed enemies were overcome by the sight of a celestial presence beyond their comprehension. Their bodies fell to the ground, unable to withstand the glory emanating from the angel. Meanwhile, the priests who awaited news received the guards' trembling report. The truth was too terrifying. The body was no longer in the tomb. In desperation, they offered money and ordered them to lie, spreading the story that the disciples had stolen the body during the night. But how could anyone silence what heaven itself had declared? The news began to spread. Among Jesus' followers, tears of sorrow turned into tears of hope. The impossible had happened. He had conquered death. Mary Magdalene was among the first to approach the tomb that morning. Her heart was heavy, her hands trembling, but when she saw the stone rolled away, her weeping turned to shock. And when she heard the gentle voice ask, "Woman, why are you crying?" she recognized the one who could never be forgotten. Her encounter with the risen one was not just an intimate moment. It was the seal that death no longer had dominion. The weeping turned into proclamation, and Mary ran through the dew-covered streets of dawn, declaring, "I have seen the Lord." The disciples, at first unbelieving, locked themselves even more tightly in the room where they hid. But suddenly, the presence that dispels fear entered without need of doors. Jesus was there, alive, showing the marks of the nails, and terror gave way to indescribable joy. Rome could not understand. How could one crucified and humiliated before all now be proclaimed victorious? The mightiest empire on earth had no answers. only questions spreading like wildfire. The priests, meanwhile, faced their greatest dilemma. How could they contain a truth spreading not only through words, but through signs, miracles, and a boldness they had never seen in the disciples? They realized they were not facing a sect, but the birth of something that would transcend generations. Meanwhile, the families who had witnessed the signs of the crucifixion began to speak in hushed voices about the resurrection. Each account fanned the flame of hope, small sparks that together became a blazing fire. Within weeks, streets once marked by silence now echoed with fervent preaching. Fishermen had become messengers. Simple men spoke boldly before crowds, proclaiming that the one who had been slain was alive forevermore. Rome could raise its swords, but it could not silence faith. Every threat only strengthened the testimony. The more they persecuted, the more it grew. For the empty tomb had become proof that no argument could deny. And so, from the darkness of the crucifixion was born the light of the resurrection. What had seemed like the greatest failure in history became the greatest triumph. The world was no longer the same, and nothing could ever erase that day. The empty tomb was not merely a grave without a body. It was God's signature upon history, declaring that death had been defeated. And since that dawn, humanity has carried a mark that divides time itself, before and after the resurrection. Then the transformation began. Simple fishermen, once fearful and timid, rose with a courage that defied empires. Fear gave way to boldness. Mourning turned into hope. The resurrection of Jesus ignited hearts and began a movement that even the fiercest persecutions could not stop. What had seemed like defeat became the greatest victory in history, and the world, once scarred by the pain of the cross, now pulsed with the hope of new life. Peter, the one who had denied the Master 3 times, now spoke in marketplaces and synagogues without fear. His voice no longer carried the shame of betrayal, but the fire of restoration. Multitudes listened and were moved, for it was not merely a speech, but a living testimony of the transformation only the resurrection could bring. John, the beloved disciple, wrote about what he had seen and heard. Every word he penned was an echo of tenderness and truth. His message was not just rational, it was filled with the love he had witnessed at the foot of the cross. His writings began to circulate, bringing comfort and courage to entire communities. Mary Magdalene, once marked by society's scorn, became an honored witness. In every encounter, she would repeat with tears in her eyes, "I have seen the Lord." Her simple voice shattered doubt, for no one could deny the light in her eyes or the strength of her conviction. Homes began to fill with songs, even in secret. Whole families gathered to break bread in remembrance of the Master. Every prayer was offered with tears. Every hidden gathering was charged with power. The movement grew like a river that could no longer be contained. Rome tried to silence it. Persecutions were unleashed. Soldiers stormed into homes, imprisoned men, and scourged women. But with every lash of the whip, faith only grew stronger. The blood of those who died did not extinguish the flame. On the contrary, it was like oil poured onto fire, spreading the message even further. The streets of Jerusalem, once stained by the pain of the crucifixion, now echoed with testimonies of miracles. The sick were healed, the blind could see, the lame walked. Each sign was like a divine signature, declaring that Jesus was alive and walking among his people. The priests, once so sure of their authority, now trembled at the rapid growth of this movement. They could no longer control the narrative. The empty tomb was an open wound in their arguments, and the more they tried to deny it, the more the truth spread. Over time, even scholars began to debate what had truly happened. Some tried to explain it through philosophy. Others admitted that something supernatural had broken through the fabric of history. But for the simple, there was no doubt. Jesus was alive, and that was enough. The impact reached far beyond Jerusalem. News of the risen one spread to distant cities. In Antioch, In Samaria, in Rome, everywhere hearts were set ablaze by this truth. What began with a few frightened men was becoming an unstoppable movement. Women, who in that culture were often ignored, now became voices of faith. Their testimonies filled communities with hope, showing that the gospel did not choose status, but reached everyone. The world began to see that the message of Christ was greater than traditions or social barriers. Then something extraordinary happened. Men who had never spoken publicly stood before crowds, proclaiming the resurrection with boldness. People of different languages began to hear the same message, as if the very Spirit of God were breathing into every heart. The impossible was unfolding before everyone's eyes. The Roman authorities were astonished. How could a group of fishermen and women shake the established order? How could a movement without armies or weapons transform entire cities? The answer was simple and unstoppable. It was not the work of men, but the work of God himself. And as the days went by, it became ever clearer that death had been defeated. The cross, once a symbol of humiliation and pain, had become an emblem of hope. Where there had been shame, now there was glory. Where there had been silence, now there was proclamation. The world was changing before everyone's eyes, not through swords, not through empires, but because an empty tomb had declared to the universe that life was stronger than death. And from that moment on, nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same. The years that followed were filled with fire and blood. The disciples preached the resurrection with such passion that crowds were moved to tears. But imprisonment, beatings, and cruel deaths also came. Still, every word, every sermon carried the mark of that day when death lost its power. The Roman Empire tried to silence the message, but it crossed borders, oceans, and centuries. And that is why today, 2,000 years later, you still hear this story, because it was not just an event. It was a turning point in all of history. Peter, once fearful, now faced crowds with the courage of a lion. His voice echoed through the streets of Jerusalem and then through other cities, proclaiming that Jesus was alive. He knew his life was in danger, yet he did not retreat. The man who once denied out of fear now preferred death over silence. John, the beloved disciple, lived many years bearing witness to what his own eyes had seen. His letters and his gospel were not written merely as records, but as invitations for every person to experience the same love and hope he had known. His words remain alive to this day, as if freshly written. Paul, once a fierce persecutor, became one of the greatest defenders of the faith. His conversion shocked everyone, but also proved that no one was beyond the reach of grace. His journeys and letters helped spread the message to the farthest corners of the empire, making the resurrection known far beyond the borders of Israel. Every martyrdom, every drop of blood shed became a seed. Men and women died in arenas, burned or thrown to wild beasts, yet their final words always carried the same name: Jesus. And that testimony was worth more than any speech, because it showed that faith was not theory, but a life fully surrendered to the end. Rome believed it could erase the movement by destroying its leaders, but the opposite happened. The more blood that flowed, the more hearts were converted. The fire of persecution only purified and strengthened, spreading even faster what they tried to silence. Entire families gathered in catacombs, caves, and hidden homes. By torchlight, they broke bread and remembered the words of the Master. Danger was constant, but so was joy. Faith became a refuge, a shelter amid the darkness of a hostile world. And not only Jews or Romans were reached. Slaves found dignity. Women found their voices, the poor discovered their worth. The gospel broke invisible chains, proclaiming that all were equal before the living God. It was a silent revolution, yet more powerful than any army. Over time, even enemies had to admit something extraordinary was happening. The name of Jesus could not be erased. On the contrary, it multiplied in every language, every culture, every generation. The empty tomb kept speaking, and that is why today, after 2,000 years, you still hear this story. Not because it was preserved in ancient books, but because it remains alive. It survived persecutions, burned empires, resisted kings and rulers, because the resurrection was not just an event of the past. It was, and still is, the victory that changed humanity's destiny forever. The death of Jesus was the day the world changed, the day time itself was split in two, the day darkness thought it had won, but light rose with a power that could never again be extinguished. Since then, no empire has been able to bury that truth. No sword has been able to cut that message. No lie has been able to extinguish that fire. From that moment on, the cross ceased to be a mere Roman instrument of torture and became an eternal symbol of hope. Where men saw shame, God revealed victory. Where blood flowed, redemption was born. What seemed like the end was, in truth, the greatest beginning ever recorded in human history. The generations that followed were shaped by that turning point. Entire nations learned to see life and death differently. Kings, sages, warriors, even enemies were moved by the simple truth that death could not hold the one who gave himself on the cross. The world had changed forever. Time itself was divided into before and after Christ. Every calendar, every historical record bears the mark of the day the Son of God was crucified. Even those who do not believe unknowingly measure their own time around that moment. And the more they tried to silence the message, the more it grew. Empires fell, kingdoms crumbled, yet faith endured. No prisons, no arenas, no fires, no exiles could silence the voices of those who proclaimed the resurrection. Ordinary men and women, people without titles or riches, dared to face rulers and priests because they carried in their hearts a certainty greater than fear. They knew the cross was not the end. They knew the empty tomb was proof that eternity had opened for all. As the centuries passed, every nation reached was transformed. Barbarian peoples were confronted by the message of grace. Slaves found dignity. Kings learned humility before the God who conquered death. The cross kept speaking, crossing borders no sword had ever conquered. And even when religion tried to distort, when politics tried to manipulate, when science tried to reduce the story to myth, the flame never went out. Because what was born that afternoon in Jerusalem was not a human invention. It was eternal life breathing over humanity. Every church hidden in caves, every prayer whispered in silence, every tear shed by martyrs watered the seed of a fire that will never be extinguished. The story of Jesus' death and resurrection kept advancing, even in the darkest of times. Even the greatest enemies were forced to acknowledge it. Roman historians recorded the effects of a movement that grew despite persecution. Governors wrote about men who preferred death to denying their faith. The cross became more powerful with every new attempt to erase it. Centuries later, kings and empires that would never bow to any other name were humbled before the message of Jesus. The cross crossed oceans, raised cathedrals, inspired movements, and transformed entire cultures. No force has ever been able to stop it. And even today, when the world tries to live as if he had never existed, the truth still echoes. Films, songs, books, testimonies, and even the collective memory of humanity still carry the weight of that day. Because the cross is not just a historical event, it is an eternal scar engraved in the heart of mankind. For millions, that fire became personal. It's not just a story we've heard, it's a flame that burns within, reminding us that life does not end in death. It's the assurance that there is something greater than this fleeting existence. It's the conviction that the cross opened the door to eternity. And even if centuries pass, even if generations rise and try to deny it, the light born on the cross keeps shining. It shines in believing hearts, in transformed families, in restored peoples. It shines in every life that decides to no longer live for itself, but for the one who conquered death. That's why, when we speak of the death of Jesus, we're not just remembering a distant event. We're talking about humanity's turning point, the day the world changed forever, the day darkness was defeated and light triumphed forever. And now, I need to look at you and ask, Do you believe this event changed humanity, or do you still think it was just a story? How many times have you felt your life sink into a heavy silence, like Jerusalem on that afternoon? Maybe this video didn't reach you by accident. Maybe it's a calling to understand that the same power that tore the veil and rolled away the stone from the tomb is still alive today. If this moved you, write in the comments, "That day changed my life." It's not just a phrase. It's a declaration. Leave your like and subscribe now, because every gesture helps this message reach more people who need hope. And believe me, when you participate, you're not only supporting this mission, you're joining a community of people seeking something greater, longing to feel that same transformation within their hearts. Because the world after the death of Jesus was never the same. And maybe, after hearing this story, your world will never be the same either.